Hello, welcome everyone to the second in our series here at the University of Washington Program on the Environment, the Conversations in Environmental Communication series for winter 2022. My name is Sean McDonald and I'm your host for this evening. We've got a great presentation this evening dealing with art and environmental communication with our guest, Rachel Lodge. Very excited to have her join us here this evening. Before we begin, though, I'd like to start with our now acknowledgement of the land. I'd like to say that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While we meet today on this virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures, as well as our commitment to the land. So I'd just like everyone just to think about that for a second before we continue. All right, well, as I said, our guest today is Rachel Lodge. She's a visual and multimedia artist whose current work explores the carbon cycle, the planetary process that underlies both our climate system and all of life. Through hand-drawn digital imagery, animation, sound, and objects, her work evokes the flow of carbon through natural and human systems from the molecular to the landscape level, helping the viewer to imaginatively engage with essential phenomena that are too small, too big, or too far away from us in space or in time to actually perceive directly. Her work has appeared in venues around the Puget Sound region, including the Museum of Northwest Art, University of Washington Botanic Garden, the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and Jack Straw Cultural Center. In 2020, she was an artist in residence at the Pacific Science Center. Professionally, she's been trained in public policy, and she's also worked extensively in state interagency and academic settings, including the University of Washington, most notably on behalf of low-income families and children. And she lives and works in Seattle. And I think that this intersection of a background in public policy and passion for art, I think really is exciting. And I am very much looking forward to hearing from Rachel today. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and give her a big round of applause, both real and digital, and welcome her to the Conversations in Environmental Communication series. So thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us. Oh, I think you're muted, Rachel.
Yeah, sure enough. There you go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. It's great to be with everybody. I really appreciate the chance to join with you all today and hope that after I talk for a while, we can have a bit of a conversation. I feel like environmental communication as a subject for a class or a conversation could hardly be more important right now. We've all got a lot on our minds about it, I know. Science, truth, the state of our own health, the state of the planet, how we talk to each other about all of that couldn't really be more important right now. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll talk about this carbon-based, science-based work that I've been doing for a while. I'll talk a little bit about the motivations that brought me to it, a little bit about the progression of the work, and I'll show you some of that. Talk a little bit about what I've been thinking about more recently. And then I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and questions, because I imagine you guys have had a chance to think about this in a way that I haven't, or not for a long time anyway. I know that Sean sent the links out to work that I had at Jack Straw last year, and a lot of you may have seen some or all of that. I will talk about it here as well, but hopefully it won't be too repetitive. So I'll talk for a little bit and then we can start looking at some stuff. So Sean was saying I came from this policy thing and now I'm doing this other thing. So how did that happen? How did I get to this kind of science-based carbon subject matter? And it's a little bit of a journey. I really didn't start out here at all. I'm not trained as a scientist. I don't actually have a lot of formal training as an artist either. What I'm trained in and have a lot of experience in actually is public policy. I did a lot of work at the state level in California and some in Washington. A lot of that work was focused around these sort of complex partnerships for low-income kids and families from the neighborhood level up to the state level. And a lot of that work was around trying to figure out how to collaborate across disciplines or across agencies. And in that work, I really got an appreciation for how important communications are to help people come to a common understanding of something, something that seems complicated, something that maybe seems hard to think about, something that involves people coming at it from really different perspectives. And in the course of doing that, I also got a real sense of how visuals can help to kind of focus and ground some of those interactions. So a lot of what I've been doing these last few years actually does come out of that policy work in a funny way. During that time, I was also making artwork, but it was just personal. I was doing it kind of on the side. It wasn't focused on the environment at all. It's more figurative work. But this whole time I was also tracking the climate issue because I'd always kind of been, although my work didn't have anything to do with it, I was always a big nature person, kind of an outdoor girl. Almost majored in physical geography as an undergrad. I really loved all that stuff, earth systems, biogeography, geomorphology. I really loved all that stuff and still do. I just find it just inherently extremely cool. I first started hearing about global warming probably sometime in the 80s or the early 90s, probably at the latest. And just with that undergrad preparation that I had, it was enough for me to understand. It's like, oh, okay, it seems like this is going to be a problem. Putting more heat into the system is probably not going to be good. But I was doing this other work, which was around kids and families and public sector stuff. And then things kind of continued to go on. By around 2014 or so, I really started feeling like my hair was on fire with the climate thing. And so I was asking myself, what can I do? I was still engaged in the work for kids, but I was starting to feel like whatever we're doing for kids isn't going to matter if we don't sort out this other thing. We're not going to have a planet to hand over to them if we don't figure out what we're doing on the climate thing. And it seemed like there was a communications aspect to what was happening or not happening with all of that. I was feeling like, wow, we're really in a pickle here. But whatever explanation is out there, it's not getting through or not enough. It's true, of course, that people were misrepresenting things and lying about it as well. But even without that, it was sort of not quite clear. And then what I realized was that it wasn't totally clear to me either, even though I had kind of a pretty good basic understanding of things like the greenhouse effect. I realized that there was stuff I didn't understand. If I really tried to boil it down, like, okay, carbon dioxide, what is that exactly? Carbon, what is that exactly? Why is it that when you burn fossil fuels, CO2 comes out? For all of you, you're probably going, come on, please, we all understand this. But for me, I realized that there are things that I didn't quite get. So the work that I've been doing now really kind of started with me trying to delve into that and really understand at kind of a basic level what was going on there. So I was really trying to explain it to myself first. And then from there, move into thinking about, is there something here that would be useful to explain to other people visually? In addition to that, I knew from my other work, people often really need help with something that seems abstract or complicated. Can this be made really vivid? Can it be made tactile? Can it be made immediate? Are we talking about things that are way over there somewhere? Or are they personal and immediate and actually embodied even in your environment? So I began to think about it that way. So that was one motivation, is there a way to demystify some of this first for myself? And then if I can do some of that, maybe for other folks, if that's useful. Another really important motivation for me at the beginning and continuing ongoing now too, is there a way for me to find a place to put my own emotions about this? I was looking for a perspective on the problem or kind of a vantage point, or even kind of a refuge. And I'll come back to that idea later a little bit. A place that was sort of emotionally sustainable, where I could spend a lot of time thinking about climate change and not just be devastated by it. So along with that, the feeling that we all need to be thinking about it. We need to be thinking about it a lot. We need to be able to do that. It's something that's of immediate concern to everybody on the planet. Is there a way that we can think about this that isn't just going to burn us out completely? So that was part of my motivation. And what goes with that, and maybe if folks want to talk about this, we could certainly talk about it later. This question with climate communications, and especially, should we be trying to raise people's anxiety level about this, or should we be trying to lower it? And I knew that for me, what I needed to do actually was lower it, not raise it. So that's part of why I've been doing the work that I've been doing in the way that I've done it. And then the last thing that was really on my mind was basically this question of what on earth are we going to tell our kids about this? How are we going to explain to them how we got into this situation, and how do we account for ourselves? So all those things were in my mind at the beginning. And, I could have gone into it from a policy angle, but for me, trying to drill down into just how does this work? Actually, the bare mechanics of atoms and molecules, I got really fascinated with that. And it ended up taking me into photosynthesis and biology and back into Earth systems, which is something that I just have always loved. And what I started to think of as sort of the root phenomena of climate change. So photosynthesis and combustion, what are those things and how do they work? So that's how I got to it. And now let's see if I can get this right. We can look at some stuff. Let's see. Okay, share screen. Oops. And Sean, tell me here in a second if this is right. Oops. Okay, are you seeing a big blue image and not my presenter notes?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So this image, I just put this up here to kind of get started. This is a composite image from this Transfigurations carbon flow installation that some of you may have had a look at. I'm just kind of still working with this image, but here's just to kind of get started. And then, as I was saying, I was trying to figure out in the first place, how do I understand what this stuff is about? And to begin with, like, what is carbon? I have to understand the mechanics of this. I need to break this all the way down for myself, all the way down to atoms and molecules. So I started spending time looking at middle school science websites and the periodic table, refreshing all this stuff I'd forgotten from high school chemistry. Starting with carbon, what the heck is it? Fourth most abundant element in the universe, 6 protons, 6 electrons, likes to join up with other atoms, which is why it's at the center of all this biology. And I just started drawing atoms to begin with. And as soon as I started doing that, you have problems of how you're going to represent things. Nobody's actually seen an atom yet, I don't quite think. So there are these diagrammatic ways of representing it, none of which is quite right. My favorite might be the second one from the right, which is, I think of that as my abstract expressionist probability field. The atom is just basically a field of energy buzzing around. But so I was just starting to explore, what does this stuff look like visually? And of course, I'll say that the science on all this is going to be old hat for most of you, but this is where I was getting started. And the past few years, I've just really been building up from there, starting with atoms, from atoms to molecules, and from there to organisms, all focused on carbon flow as I've gotten to learn more about it. And I've worked on that through print series and several different animations and collections of objects. Here's a drawing, just kind of fooling around with the structure of graphite, carbon in pure mineral form. Of course, you guys all know the other pure mineral form is diamond. So I was kind of fascinated with the idea that there are these layers of graphene, which is graphite. When you're making a mark on the paper, you're basically laying off these thin sheets of carbon. And this is the same stuff that's in the air in the form of carbon dioxide, or it's in diamonds or plankton or whales or the human body. And I like the idea that a person making a drawing is basically, you can think of it as sort of your carbon making a drawing of yourself in a way. So that was starting with atoms, then having to think about carbon dioxide, which is kind of the protagonist of the whole climate story. It's a molecule, it's invisible, can't see it. And I felt like that's one of the issues, I think, in helping people grasp the problem we've been having, is you can't see the source of it. So I started This is a really simple little animation that I was starting to do this kind of stuff. The point about it is that you can't see it, but it's there, and it's emerging and being in the form of emissions all over the place. And of course, when I was starting to do this, I had to figure out, how do I help people understand what it is that I'm trying to show them? Okay, that's a carbon dioxide molecule. I think this is running a little bit slow because of the computer, but there are tailpipe emissions. There are emissions coming from that power plant or whatever it is. And then up in the upper left is a little parts per million carbon dioxide counter, which is not running in sync with what's happening on the screen, of course, but just to try to join those ideas together. The stuff that you're doing in every day has an impact on that parts per million count. And it also kind of got me thinking about the atmosphere kind of as a volumetric space. When you put objects in there and float them around, it kind of gives you more of a sense of the air as substance rather than just vacancy, which was interesting to me too. Here's a clip from a little longer video that I did afterwards called Carbon Meditation. This was more in the vein of me beginning to think about photosynthesis a little bit more, but also on that notion of trying to create a space, kind of a breathing space for thinking about some of this. This particular video doesn't really go into climate damage, but it's more on this idea of we're all inhaling and exhaling within this natural system, and carbon dioxide is actually at the center of that. Birding folks might recognize that hermit thrush. So I was just starting to think about our sort of integral place in the nature of things with respect to these elements of the atmosphere that we have to think about now because of climate change so much. Oops. I also started getting interested in carbon, not just as imagery about carbon, but also carbon as stuff, as actual material. And I started collecting stuff. So this is when I was still working on this in my studio space. I have 12 jars of carbon-based stuff, most of which is very everyday, but you may not think about it so much. I've got a jar of anthracite, coal, graphite, fake diamonds, paraffin, which is a petroleum derivative, plankton, leaves, dirt, food, us, human bodies, about 18% carbon, and a jar of air, which you can't see here. And I had put this together a while ago, and I've had the chance to take it around to various places, including the residency I had at Pacific Science Center. I've had a chance to talk to a lot of people about it. It's actually a pretty good teaching tool, turns out, for helping people think about the carbon cycle and kind of where we all fit. I actually had people at PAXI, I had people weighing themselves to find out what was their body weight in carbon. I didn't think anybody was going to want to do that, but actually people did. I had the jar series and a series of prints at the Botanic Garden at UW several years ago, 19 digital prints. It was the first time that I tried to kind of carry through a narrative from atoms and molecules all the way through to where we are now, fossil fuel combustion and the situation that we're in. These are just a couple of the images from the beginning of that series. It's atoms and molecules on the left, and stomata and carbon dioxide entering a leaf. here's another one from toward the end of the sequence. And all of these had a small amount of text that goes with them. This one on the top, I don't know how well you can see that. Those are, again, parts per million on the top. The parts per million figure is 312 parts per million, which is the amount of parts per million roughly that were measured at the time that I was born, or estimated at the time that I was born in 1955. And the bottom row was when I made that image, which was in 2018. So in my lifetime, we went from 312 parts per million to 406. And of course, that was in 2018. I think I've seen counts now of 414 or 415 in the last year or so, which is just crazy. So trying to get the idea of where this has been going. In that exhibit, I also was looking for kind of every way I could think of to kind of concretize the idea of this carbon having been moving around for a really long time. I borrowed some leaf print fossils from the Burke. These two are leaves from the Carboniferous, so around the time that coal was being laid down. So that was cool. You can actually get your hands on this stuff. The Burke will loan it to you. In that exhibit, I also had some pieces. I was working with Karen Copper, who got her PhD at the school there. She's a fire ecologist with North Cascades National Park, and she was doing a study on fire samples from the east side of the park and their history of fire. And so I had 4 samples that I worked with her on. This one was germinated in 1804, which was the first year of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And what I was trying to get at there, I had kind of generated these little marks to show the scars of where the years that the fires were. And Karen was able to give that history. So I had a little story kind of that went with each one of these samples based on her data, and gave a rough calculation of the weight in each sample to just, again, underscore, if you're looking at a tree, you're looking at something that's about 50% carbon by weight. And so this piece of wood that you're looking at is, I forget, but it's it's about somewhere between 1.3 and 1.6% carbon. So just trying to underscore that idea. This is from an exhibit that I was part of at the Museum of Northwest Art in 2018. This was a group of artists and scientists working as partners on representing the climate impacts in the Skagit River Basin. And I had the good fortune to work with Dave Peterson, who some of you who probably know, emeritus professor from the School of Forestry there. This animation was a 2-channel animation, as you see it here, with two frames. It was called Inhale, Exhale. And using it kind of as a reflection on what's happening with the forests there in the watershed. And I used 2 screens because I wanted to be able to look at things at 2 different scales at the same time, both kind of the micro and the macro. The bird audio in this, again, is from the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, and there's some additional audio from Dashiell Nadler-Fennell, who I adapted with his permission. But this is going a little farther into photosynthesis and just the idea of the natural world engaging in this inhale, exhale continually. I was trying to get to the actual formation of glucose. And that actually does show you 6 CO2 molecules in, 6 water forming glucose, and then 6 oxygen molecules going out. In the top level, imagining you're on the inside of the leaf and you're watching the oxygen exit. Oops. Here's another segment. I'm going to shorten this up a little bit in the interest of time. That show at the museum was mostly about the impacts of climate change, but I wanted to at least touch on the causes of climate change. So there goes an oil tanker, say, going by with its emissions, and then looking at the consequences for the forest, which is that the global warming makes it, as I'm sure you guys all know, it makes it drier and warmer, and more vulnerable to insect infestation. So with an increased risk of fire. So that's what I was trying to get at here. Oh, sorry. So I've just continued with the same kind of set of ideas, and hopefully sort of developing them a little bit more each time I get another crack at it. Sort of last year, I had the chance to do a multimedia exhibit at Jack Straw Cultural Center here in the U District, the residency at the New Media Gallery, and the exhibit was called Transfigurations, Carbon Flow. The same idea, carbon's flowing all the time, and it's sort of shape-shifting, both on its own through all this incredible biology, but also through us setting all this ancient plant matter on fire to get the energy. So this was, again, a 2-channel video. It was on 2 walls. I had a lot more space this time. And many of you may have had a look at this already because I know Sean sent the link, so I'll try to go through this a little more quickly. And just to mention that Jack Straw is mostly concerned with sound arts. So I was working on all this imagery, but it was a chance to work with them on the audio. I had studio time with them, excuse me, and also engineering help, which was great. So the animation starts out with kind of a flourish. It's carbon in the universe coming across the night sky. You're looking at it here flat, side by side, rather than at an angle. So you can imagine that you're surrounded on 2 sides and that the carbon atoms are much bigger than your head. So those were constellations, and there's the configuration of diamond on the left, on the right, and graphite on the left. And I'll try to go through this relatively quickly because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. After that introduction at the beginning, every time I've done this, I have to figure out a way to sort of make sure that folks are oriented as to what all these little shapes are. So sort of walking through the relevant atoms and molecules, carbon dioxide and water. More on photosynthesis. This time I didn't try to animate the formation of glucose. Of course, when I did that, the one I just showed you was incredibly basic. I was leaving out hundreds of steps, I think. With this one, I just kind of gave the formula as a suggestion of what's going on. There's the formula on the left and glucose and cellulose on the right. From there, we sort of leave the notion of hand drawing on the page and go off into nature. really interested in all of these incredibly complex patterns that develop out of these basic biochemical processes. And the notion that something invisible and intangible in the air is constantly turning into this solid stuff all the time. And this is not something that's separate from us that we're just looking at. It is us. Carbon is flowing through us. It is us. I'll stop that there. In those images, it can really just only begin to hint at everything that's going on there with respiration and certainly with eating. But hopefully it's enough to kind of get the idea across. The video goes on from there to look at carbon in the ocean a little bit, plankton, and here's a giant sea bass. A little bit more about that later, just quickly. Krill grazing on plankton. Plankton then is sinking to the ocean floor and taking all the carbon with it, which over millions of years becomes the source for petroleum. A sequence with pump jacks bringing all that old carbon up from underground. And of course, there goes all the carbon dioxide from millions of years ago back up into the atmosphere. A sequence on fire. And then an ending sequence where thinking of the whole thing as a story, partly about us, I didn't want to, in the video, I didn't really want to come to a conclusion about how this story was going to end. I just wanted to look at this flow again, just the pattern of it. So now just to wrap up, I'll talk just quickly about some of what I've been working on lately. I'm sort of continually looking for ways to evoke that flow that is so central to all of our life. But I've also just been really interested in kind of the embodiment of carbon in any particular form and what kinds of patterns that makes. So this is just kind of playing visually with the structure of diamond. Here are some phycoloids. This is from an electron micrograph, a plant physiology textbook. Most of that's way over my head, but they're amazing structures within the cell. I just like the way this looked. It's on the left side, it's photoshopped over an image of a watercolor of plankton. Playing with leaf forms. These are just some of many that have their own names. It's just something that I've been playing with. The idea of spots, there are lots of spots and polka dots in nature, which I just think is really fun. Here's the giant sea bass again, this huge fish. You can think of it as a transient store of carbon swimming around in the kelp beds offshore of my hometown in Southern California. The species, thankfully, is not protected. Here's some carbon on the hoof. Been kind of playing with this. If the giant sea bass is polka dots, the zebra is stripes. The zebra is so great, you really don't have to do anything with it visually. It's like this op art creature just walking around. Just playing with that a little bit more. The tree shapes here are actually what's called a reniform leaf pattern from a few slides ago, blown up. There's not really any science behind this image, no science at all, actually. The zebra wouldn't want to be solo like this, I'm sure. But I liked the way it looked put together. And actually, perhaps there's also a message in it. Don't let the zebras be by themselves, take care of them. Make sure they have lots of company as herd animals. And so just to wrap up, been wanting to explore the connection between the climate crisis and the need that we have to sink carbon as much as possible, and also the biodiversity crisis. So I've been interested in learning more about initiatives like Half Earth or 30 by 30. And I've been really interested to read about some of the mapping that's been done recently, suggesting that there's a lot of overlap between some of the most significant carbon stores and the places that also have the highest biodiversity on the planet. And, again, in thinking about this constant carbon flow and the need to keep it going, to keep the drawdown going, as well as keeping the existing soil carbon and that kind of thing in place, needing to protect that. And knowing that natural systems are not enough to take care of the whole overburden of CO2 that we have right now, but they're definitely an essential part of the solution, as you all know. And that kind of gets back finally to the idea of refuge again. People talking about literal refuges, marine refuges, places, terrestrial refuges, which I think are going to be incredibly important for all of us. For me, I can also take a kind of psychic refuge in these amazing processes that will continue as long as life does. Photosynthesis, these chains of life from one organism to another. I feel like, for me, I kind of feel like I can say they're real. I can trust them. I think we can trust those things in a time when it's sort of, a lot of things feel kind of shaky out there right now. For as long as we're alive, photosynthesis is working and is trustworthy. And I sometimes tell myself, go out and watch photosynthesis happen. So I think I'll leave it there. And thank you so much. I look forward to any thoughts or questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. I'd like to make sure we give Rachel a round of applause for her presentation, for sharing her work with us. So I encourage you to do that either electronically or actually. Thank you so much. And at this time, I would love to invite questions from our audience. Those of you joining us from the Zoom, you can add your questions to the chat, or you can raise your little digital hand and we can call on you. You can ask your question live. If you're joining us on the YouTube, you can type your questions in the chat on YouTube and I'll make sure that I relay those. I see that we have our first questioner up. Katya, do you want to ask a question? Oh, I think you're muted maybe.
Yeah. Hi, Rachel. I wanted to ask, I know it can be challenging to try to communicate the message that you want through artwork. And I wanted to ask, do you think people always understand what you're trying to say and do they resonate with the artwork?
No, they don't always understand. Well, actually, let me be a little bit more precise about that. I think people understand the general intent. They understand it at the level of kind of a macro message. They understand that I'm trying to convey something about the beauty of nature and the fact that we belong in it. People do tend to get that. On the specifics, like exactly how photosynthesis works or how combustion works or particulars about where we're at with the climate crisis, no, people will miss things. And I take some accountability for that. You're right, it is challenging to use art to do this. I'm constantly trying to balance how much factual information I should try to build into it, how to do that, and knowing that if I let things get too specific or too complex, I'm also going to lose people. So I'm always having to try to think about how to simplify things enough to make them accessible without falsifying them. And that's not always easy to do. And there are times when I hope I don't send people out with misconceptions. I'm always worried about that. My sense is that I'm not generating a lot of misconception, but what is happening is that there are certain important details that people don't necessarily get. And I just have to kind of accept that, like I said, I think the larger message about we need to think about this, we need to take care of it, it's beautiful, it matters. I think that message does seem to come through a lot of the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rachel, appreciate it. Jasmine, I see you have your hand up.
Hi. So in this talk, I heard you talk a lot about like having to re-educate yourself on the basic like science of climate change and the greenhouse gases. And in one of your past talks that about the carbon art that I watched on YouTube, you talked about reading like middle school education websites to refresh your memory. But what I was wondering is like what differences, or if there were any differences, that you noticed in current websites and educational readings about environmental issues from like what you learned when you went to school.
Wow. And you're talking to somebody who went to school, meaning like middle school, a long time ago. So I got to say, I don't remember anything about carbon from when I was in middle school. I did take high school chemistry and I had a pretty good teacher. So some of that stuck with me, but not anything to do with carbon. I took botany at the university. And it's amazing how little of that stuck to me. I remembered enough about basic chemistry that I could kind of get reoriented with atoms and molecules. At least I had a little bit of a foundation with that. In terms of how instruction has changed, if that's kind of what you're wondering about over the years, I can't really answer that because my own memory from my own life is so poor. But what I have noticed, what I'm aware of, is that in the last 5 or 6 years, you may or may not know about this, here in the state of Washington, for instance, the governor funded climate education specifically as something that's to be available to every district. And I have been watching somewhat closely what's going on with what's available as curriculum to those folks. I actually, there are folks who have taken some of my stuff and worked with it in classroom. I actually just heard from a teacher yesterday who used some of my stuff in a really simple way. And they were 5th graders, I think. Actually, it was a bilingual Spanish class, which is kind of cool. I think that in education, my sense is that folks are really trying to get their arms around what is a good way to teach about this. People teach carbon cycle, but my sense is it's pretty uneven. I've talked to kids who've come out of these classes who know as much as I do about the carbon cycle, and they're like 9 or 10. And I've also talked to kids who didn't have anything. And I've also talked, like at the Science Center, I've talked to a lot of adults, including well-educated adults, who hardly know the first thing about any of this. There are a lot of adults for whom that's true. So my sense is the education thing is kind of a moving target. It's folks are trying to move it along in the right direction, but it's pretty uneven right now, I think.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I am struck, Rachel, by your use of animations, and which I find really fascinating. And I'm wondering if you were already working with animation, and then you had the idea to sort of focus in on the carbon cycle, or were you thinking, in order to do justice to the carbon cycle, we need to start with, we need to animate. This can't be fixed. We have to really think about flow.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it pretty much was climate change that got me on the animation. I mean, I remember being at Disneyland when I was 7 and looking at a flip book that had Minnie Mouse on it and thinking it was one of the greatest things I'd ever seen. So I've been interested in animation, but what pushed me into it was really the subject matter. And it's just, as you said, it's because as soon as I started to look at it, it's like this, the whole point is that the carbon's not static. We're digging it up and burning it. It's going up into the air. It's being drawn down from the air through photosynthesis. So I did feel like I need a way to show the movement. And once I started doing that, it was also well, this is fun. I can make these little polka dots float across the screen.
That's great. Paisley asks online, what type of media tools do you use to create your animations?
Yeah, everything is drawn. Let's see, I've got to get my gallery view back up here. There we go. Everything is drawn by hand on paper to start. And then I scan it into Photoshop. Sometimes do a lot of manipulating in Photoshop, all kinds of stuff in Photoshop. The digital prints that I've got are sometimes 10, 15, 20 layers within Photoshop as a still print. The animation, I'm starting with Photoshop and then putting stuff into After Effects and doing the animation in After Effects, which is a Adobe motion graphic software. And then, like with that Jack Straw exhibit, I don't know how many clips, maybe 30 different animation clips. And I edited those together in Premiere. And then I did the audio for all of that in Adobe Audition. So I was working 4 different kinds of software on that one. It almost killed me, but.
Well, it's really impressive when it all comes together. Lucy, I want to go ahead and give you an opportunity to ask your question.
Hi, Rachel. So kind of talking more about education around climate change issues, I was wondering, when you were kind of refreshing your memory and learning about environmental issues yourself, did you notice that visual imagery tended to be the best or most successful communicator? Or so do you feel that way yourself? Or when you're trying to educate people through your artwork, do you feel like it's an effective communicator?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about how much I loved physical geography and all that stuff when I was an undergrad 100 years ago. Part of the reason I liked it so much, I think, is because so much of the depiction of what we were learning was visual. So there were these amazing visuals of, let's say, the way a storm formation and warm fronts and cold fronts and things like that. There was a lot of stuff that was diagrammed. I thought all that was really cool. I could also see in some of the policy work that I talked about, I could see that, there were a lot of issues about using pictures and images in any context like that. But there are things that you can do through the use of images that just, especially when language is, as it very often is in policy and probably in the environmental world as well, there's a lot of language that is sort of cloudy and placeholder-ish. So part of the reason I got on the carbon thing, for instance, is that I was noticing, okay, I get it, it's carbon dioxide, but what I'm hearing a lot is carbon pollution, carbon emissions, decarbonization, carbon footprint. What does any of that actually mean? And I kind of recognized from my previous work, those were kind of little placeholder buzz phrases that were open to interpretation, actually, which is part of why I wanted to try to start anchoring this. Okay, we're talking about carbon. This is an element. It looks like this, So that's kind of a lot of how I got into it. I don't think pictures do everything, but I think they can have a lot of value, even in a public policy setting. And also, I think and part of the reason for that is they also activate a different part of your brain. And that's very much part of what I've been thinking about in this recent work, is that, the analytic at least my understanding is the analytic side of your brain is through the left side, which is the language side usually. And the right-hand side is more intuitive, more holistic. And in some degrees, maybe where your emotions sit more. And something that I've thought about for a long time, all the way back to my kids and family stuff, was it's not just how do you say, okay, here's an issue, da, 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 da. It's also, why does this matter? What does it mean? Why do you care? And that's a matter of being attached to it in some way, or having an emotion or a feeling about it. And images really help with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Well, different Lucy Terry, you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah. I was wondering if you've ever personally experienced lately in like kind of a prevalent time full of like climate crisis misinformation and resistance to scientific fact, if you've noticed if that at all impacts how some of your artwork is received, or has it changed like how you specifically communicate on certain processes to do with climate change?
Right. I haven't had much direct encounter with folks who are in like a denying space or in a, disinformation space. And there's a ton of disinformation out there right now about everything. I haven't bumped into that much. I probably, when I was at PacSci, I probably encountered a few folks who didn't really believe in this stuff. My intent from the beginning in doing this was not really to counter that anyway. I was kind of not really thinking, okay, I'm going to do something that's going to convince the deniers. What I was more interested in was making this more salient and more interesting and maybe more curiosity provoking for folks like us who are not deniers, but just sort of didn't know that much about it and maybe didn't know where to engage. As I was, I think, saying before, I'm not so worried that sort of deniers are going to like trash the stuff and get a hold of it or something like that. It's more, like I said, that if I can help it, I don't want any misconceptions to come out of what I'm doing. I think it's very hard to avoid that though, because I'm working at this level of generality. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it totally does. Thank you.
Great. Karina, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, I was wondering, so you mentioned and talked a bit about shelter and how you felt your calling was to reduce climate anxiety rather than increasing it. And I was just sort of wondering how you came to feel that, and also how one might identify when is appropriate to respond to either increasing or reducing that kind of anxiety, especially through art.
Mm-hmm. Well, to begin with, I think I was mentioning, I was trying to get the anxiety down first and foremost for me, because for a long time, I was like, oh man, this is bad. I myself don't want to deal with what's coming here. So, but feeling like at the same time, I really want to be able to think about this. So in the first instance, it was really for me. This is a way that works for me to stay engaged with this. And then maybe it works for others. And I think there probably is a time to like, wake up, like don't look up, the movie. I have sort of mixed feelings about that, the movie myself personally, but I think it's probably really great for some folks. I sort of decided that was not where I was going to go. I was not going to go to politics, and I was not going to go to opposition. I think what I've been kind of groping my way toward is a way of understanding this whole situation that we're in. And it runs counter to a lot of the way people are thinking lately, I think, is to be less interested in driving a conflict. Although I think, the fossil fuel people, we need to quit emitting yesterday. And I'm totally in support of the work that people are doing as a matter of emergency and urgency to just stop this stuff we're doing. It needs to stop yesterday. But I think what I've been trying to do, maybe in a way, is to look down the road a little bit and say, I'm also really aware that we're going to be dealing with a lot of grief. So the opposition and the anger is one thing, but there's also the grief thing. And if we're going to stay on this and take care and do what we need to do, we need a way that we can stick with this and think about it that sort of allows that to happen, but that is just a little softer. At least that's true for me. And I think, at least for some of the other folks that I encounter.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really insightful. I like to think of it that way. I also appreciate that you called carbon dioxide the protagonist here, and not necessarily the antagonist, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've thought about that a fair amount. Because when I first started doing this, I was, we've all been tuned into Al Gore in varying degrees. He's still talking about it, I think, is carbon dioxide is a pollutant. And of course, we have way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a disaster. It's a desperate emergency. So I get why he's saying that. But I also have thought, well, if you leave it at that, it really does open people to misconceptions about what carbon dioxide actually is. And it leaves totally to the side the fact that you actually need to kind of love, what I've said to kids is we love our CO2. We just need to have exactly the right amounts in the right places. You need to have, if you had no CO2 in the atmosphere, it'd be too cold. None of us would be here. And plants would have nothing to live on. So you want CO2 in the atmosphere, and you don't want too little either, but you don't want too much. So it's a question of rebalancing, but actually really respecting this stuff. I think about it in terms of carbon stewardship, which is to say, excuse me, be really conscious of where the carbon is. You want it standing up in all those forests. You want it in the soil underneath. You want a certain amount, but not too much in the air. You want it in the ocean, but not in the form of, I forget the name of the chemical that you get with OA. But to think about it that way as a question of balance and sort of a paradigm of restoration and rebalancing. The pollution paradigm, I totally get it. I'm completely in sympathy, but that's sort of the opposition paradigm. And I think we need that, but for my money, we also need this other way of thinking about it.
Yeah, very interesting. Jessica, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. First off, I just want to say your art is something truly, truly unique on its own. I will say before even like coming to the seminar, just diving into your work, just to do a little bit more research about you, I was truly mesmerized about your perspective just on the environment itself. It's something I've never seen before.
Oh, thank you so much.
Of course. And diving more so like the nature of your work, I think the one thing that kind of mesmerized me in that aspect was your sound effects that you added with the work. To me, I felt like it added like a lot of breath, like of life to your work. So my question to you is where did you find that idea of adding like these sound elements, these natural sound elements, and connecting it with your work?
Some of it probably was keep it simple because I don't have the technical skills to do anything more complicated, at least at the beginning. I can't remember how I landed on that bird call idea, but like that whole carbon meditation video is just bird audio all the way through. I can't remember how I landed on that, but I'm like an intermediate birder, but I really love birds. And I bird by ear as much as I can. So it just sort of made sense to me to put that in there. It's the soundtrack of a natural environment. So that's where I started. And then in wanting to do some other stuff that was, more atmospheric. Actually, some of the audio for that inhale exhale video comes from my nephew, who's a really good kind of electronic composer. And then the one that I did at Jack Straw, what I was thinking about there was really how to come up with audio that was kind of spatial, because I had the literal space that I could work with, which was nice, and expert folks there to help me think about it. But I was also looking for audio that was, some of it was nature-based, but things that would cycle or repeat in this rhythmic way to kind of reinforce the idea that we've got a lot of stuff in nature that's spinning or cycling. Atoms are spinning, to kind of get that kind of go out and come back, kind of go and return kind of motion. So that was part of what I was thinking about with the audio.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really, as Jessica said, I felt the same way. I really enjoyed not just the visuals and the animation, but the sound quality was just, it made it all so very interesting and unique. I'd love to see one of your installations actually live. That would be fantastic to see. Well, I want to be respectful of your time and the time of our attendees. We have reached 5:30, And so as I normally do around this time, I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. And I want to thank you, Rachel, for being with us and sharing your work. It's been fantastic to hear from you. And it's definitely giving us a lot of food for thought in our environmental communications work in our classroom activities as well. For folks who are joining us on YouTube, thank you so much. If you have questions, you can add those to the chat on YouTube. And I just want to remind everyone that we will be back again next week, next Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for our next in our series on the